Welcome to the Intentionists podcast, where we explore the interplay between intuition, spiritual health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Hillary Zwallen.
And I'm Amy Schreiber. Our intention is to create a dialogue that inspires you to consciously forge your path with curiosity and compassion for life and its mysteries.
Thank you for joining us this week. This is our second series on how to be your own healer. And today's topic within that is about self-love, undoing the myth of perfection, and we're going to be discussing the mental and emotional body. We're going to start first with a quote from Louise Hay. And she says, "We are each responsible for our experiences. Every thought we think is creating our future. The point of power is always in the present moment. We must be willing to begin to learn to love ourselves. Self-approval and self-acceptance in the now are the keys to positive changes. When we really love ourselves, everything in our life works."
Great.
So,
that's a great quote.
thank you.
Yeah, so in this myth of perfection that I think follows so many of us around throughout our lives, whether it's given to us in our families, in our religions, in our schools, this is an important myth that we need to address and undo if we hope to find any sort of balance and healing in, like, mentally, I think. Where do So what do you think, like, are the main, like, why do we buy into this concept?
First of all, I think, and I'm just speculating here, but I think that women buy into it way more than men do. I feel like looking at my husband and his friends, they're like so happy in their dad bods, and they just feel like amazing. And I see a lot of women we're like constantly obsessing over our physical appearance. And I mean, I think it stems from being in a patriarchal society, you know, just overall, like, we've just had men running the show for so long. And so when the messages, the underlying messages is that we're good for our bodies and our physical appearances are really important. And it hasn't been as much about everything else. And then I think we also live in a very materialistic society that is, I mean, we've got advertisements and just kind of bombarding us from a very young age. And I see it even with my little boys, you know, they're just so aware of advertisements, you know, and I think that when those messages and now we've got social media and all of that. So the downside of that is that we see all these perfectly curated images and we think, well, their life is better than ours. And my life would be better if I strived for more perfection, you know. Plus, we're in kind of an achiever society, too, where it's like, right, look at me with all my, like, we're validated by our achievements at least in American society, I would say. Wouldn't you say? I don't know.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think it's very superficially focused, everything we are bombarded with in the media. And in the media, too, it's showcasing the top, 0.01% of, like, exceptions. You know, that's not normal. And so everyone who walks around in normal life feeling normal, like normal has become a negative thing, based on what is shown to us in the media. Like, we're constantly striving for this, like, to be the exception. We want to be different and better,
Unique, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I think, it begins probably most, like, when you're a teenager, you get all your teenage angst and, like, the exceptionalism of, like, no one understands me. I have unique problems and no one will ever get me. And, like, that whole thing, I think starts there, but it's everywhere.
And I will say that I think that there are companies and there are ad campaigns that are trying to change that there is more consciousness around, that all body types are okay, all skin colors are okay. There is a narrative that is emerging that is that's really bringing that about, wouldn't you say? I mean, but it's programmed on such a small, like at such a young age, especially for women. I think just this idea that like I need to look a certain way and I need to get my hair colored this way, or I need to have these eyelash extensions, or I need to lose this much weight. And I've even seen that with my own process, going from a teen to my 20s to being pregnant and then having a baby and dealing with all of that afterwards, and just the whole identity mind screw that happens when you're like, you know, when you're trying to figure out your body after a baby, and then like your worth and all of that. So yeah, I don't know. Where do we go from there? Walking through. Yeah. I mean, I just think we're reacting to a lot of our programming and the stories we buy into about ourselves. Yeah,
I agree. And I think you're right that it is changing slowly. I mean, I noticed this in kids' movies. Like the kids' movies that are coming out now compared to what was coming out when we were kids are much, much different. Like way better about introducing maybe non-traditional ideas of whether it's gender or
right.
I mean, like what's important, you know? Like the only thing we had was Belle in Beauty and the Beast, who like, oh, she liked to read, and so she like valued being smart, but she was also like in love with.
But she fell in love with her character. Right. Yes. And then Ariel, who just gave up her voice for a man, right?
Yes.
Like, oh, I'll just give you my voice so I can be with this man who can save me. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The narratives people are becoming more conscious about how these narratives affect us as a society and on an individual level. And really, you know, I was thinking about, it doesn't really matter where you come from. I mean, this is kind of a universal principle. I don't know that everyone tries to be, there are some cultures that are more perfectionistically driven. Is that the right way to say it? Than others. But I think we all have those insecurities of like, am I thin enough? Am I cool enough? Am I good looking enough? Am I doing the right thing? Are people going to like me? I mean, everybody has that. And it like, it's triggered by different things at different times in our lives.
It's manifest in different ways depending who you are and where you come from. But I think the underlying result that happens when we operate from that is always going to be shame, like shame and guilt that we're not living up to it. And then like self-loathing, you know, it's just this vicious cycle that operates under the surface often. So the trick is to become aware of this and catch yourself, you know, so you don't have to operate from that place. You can operate from a different belief system.
Yeah. So the first way of overcoming is of the myth of perfection is recognizing that you're buying into the myth of perfection, right? It's the awareness. The awareness is the first step in healing or in changing. So I have a little quote here. When we have some pattern buried deeply within us, we must become aware of it in order to heal the condition. Perhaps we begin to mention the condition, to complain about it, or to see it in other people. It rises to the surface of our attention in some way, and we begin to relate to it. We often attract a teacher, a friend, a class, or a workshop, or a book to ourselves that begins to awaken new ways to approach this dissolving of the problem. And that's from this Louise Hay book, that You Can Heal Your Life, that fell into my lap this week. So I thought, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to quote from this book this week for our podcast. So
yeah, I think anyway. To go along with that, once you recognize that these things are at play, I think accepting the fact that it's okay to be wrong, like you don't recognize it and then beat yourself up because you've been like operating from this terrible standpoint, you know, you realize that it's okay to be wrong. And like, if you're wrong and you recognize it, then you have the chance to improve. But if you're certain, like you're never wrong, I think that's a really dangerous place to live, because you will never improve and you will never grow.
And so when you say, that you're never wrong. You're talking about like for if someone's like so prideful that they're like, no, I'm right. I am a piece of crap. Like I am not a good person, or I'm never going to be enough. And they're like stubborn in that belief.
I think stubborn.
Is that what
I'm
you're talking about?
Being stubborn in any belief to the point where you can't examine the underlying patterns and motives for why you're acting the way you're acting. Like
I was thinking about this. I was having this conversation with one of my sister-in-laws last night. We were talking about this, just the negative voice in your head. And I've been pondering that a lot this week because of our episode coming up. And she was talking about a conversation she had with a friend that was like, that she like envisioned that there's just all these people outside of her, like whispering negative things in her ear, and that she's buying into it, that it's not really her, but that there's like this thing that's placed upon her that kind of is telling her these bad things, and that she's buying into it. And I think that I don't totally buy into that belief, but I can see how that belief is perpetuated in certain cultures and why that would be a helpful way to view it. If you recognize that the self-talk is like not your pure essence, and maybe you assign it to, I don't like the idea that like we're being influenced by negative beings all the time. Mm-hmm. Like I just don't believe that, but that doesn't mean that other people can't believe it and that can't work for them in the same way as that. Am I making sense now? Because I'm wondering if I'm making sense.
I mean, I think what you're saying is that we build frameworks in our mind of like ways to think about things, and none of it's real. Like they're all symbols for like these abstract ideas that no one really knows how to explain. So it doesn't necessarily matter like what it is, like how you describe it to yourself. It's just like what is helpful to you in changing these things, these maybe negative belief patterns. I mean, and going back to like she feels like she's being influenced externally. For me, I think it's super important to constantly question my motives and values. And the first thing in that questioning is to see if they are even my values or are they someone else's that have been imposed upon me.
That's such a great point.
And then to give yourself permission, like, again, don't feel all ashamed that you adopted someone else's values and made all these decisions based on it. Just stop doing it, like change that story.
Right. Bring the awareness and then change the story. Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, so this week I was, I've probably already told the story on the podcast about when I went to visit you in Olympia and we went to go see your palm reader friend. And she was talking to me about my negative self-talk. And at the time I've been really reflecting about this week, because I was thinking about kind of the mental place that I was in when we had sold our business, and just, I was so bogged down with my life. I was just exhausted, and I was, probably 20 pounds heavier than I wanted to be. I just had the most negative narrative going on in my mind, and I didn't even realize it. And I was trying to change all of that. And I remember meeting with her, and that's what she said to me. And she was like, oh my gosh, if you were to hear the way you speak to yourself, you would like, if you were just like a random stranger that came up to talk to yourself, you would chase them off with a shotgun because you were being so mean. And I was like, what are you really? And I really had to sit with that. But I think about it now, that was a year and a half ago or longer. And I think, my goodness, I've made such an effort this year to be really gentle with myself. And I've noticed that through that process, there's come a lot of not only like emotional healing, but like physical healing and mental healing. And today I was in yoga and I was like thinking about our episode, which I'm trying not to think about it. I'm trying to breathe. But of course we get to the end and you're doing all the hip openers. And so the emotions start flowing. And for those people that don't do yoga on the regular, the hip openers are always kind of emotional. Would you say that, Amy? Is that the case for you, that like all the things bubble up when you're like in pigeon or you're, opening your hips up? But I don't know why. True. So, so I'm sitting there and I I started thinking about our episode and I was like, oh, I'm going to send myself all kinds of positive affirmations. And I was kind of like chuckling in my mind's eye about this. I was like laughing to myself silently, of course. But I just went through, I was like, body, you are so great. Thank you for being here and for working so hard. And I like literally went like organ by organ. I was like, heart, thank you for pumping so consistently my whole life. And stomach, thank you for digesting my food. And it was like, you know, I felt kind of like Stuart Smalley, like the Saturday Night Live sketch where they're like, gosh darn it, and people like you. But I felt like as I went through each organ in my body that I really did feel like this deep and abiding love for my body. And I thought, my gosh, who cares how it looks on the outside? Think about all these amazing things it's doing for me. Think about this skin that protects me from the elements, and this food that helps, you know, my stomach that helps me digest food. So it gives me energy, and my hair that is growing, and, you know, my skin and whatever, you know,
I think so. You are bringing up a really important concept that I've been wanting to ask you about. So you called what you just did affirmations, but it sounded more like a gratitude practice. Like you were
totally.
You weren't.
I mean, semantics, right?
But I think that like it may. You can tell me what you think, but I think there might be an important difference between that, because you are thanking your body for something that it is actually doing. Like it's in reality. You weren't like saying to your body, thank you for being 3 inches taller and 20 pounds thinner, you know, something that's not reality, that is further. So I think like there's a danger with affirmations in that way. Like if you are standing in front of the mirror saying, I am happy, like that's reinforcing the fact that you're not happy, I think subconsciously. What do you think about that? I've been thinking,
I don't know about that. I don't know. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I think that you're right in that there's a distinction between like that what I was doing actually was a gratitude practice. And that's something that maybe people will relate to that more than, you know, doing affirmations or whatever.
What's the line between like accentuating the positive and like an affirmation that may like accentuate the negative, really?
I think so the way that I see it with affirmations is we have to acknowledge the emotion, right? Like, so if we're suffering and we're in pain, right? We're like, if you know, we're going through a deep loss or a tragedy or a breakup or something that's really hard, then we give ourselves a moment and we really feel the feeling, and we visualize it, and we visualize it passing through our bodies, and just, we let it come in as a wave and we breathe it out. And then we bring in, you know, I'm calling peace and serenity to me now. I am whole. I'm at peace. I call happiness to me. And I don't see that being a dangerous thing. I think of it like, I think that there's a difference in being in denial, like where you're standing in the mirror and you're hating yourself and you're crying and you're like, I'm happy. You know, that's like living a lie. Right. So there's a way to be gentle. I think that it's how we speak to ourselves, and there's a way to be gentle that way. And so this is like the roundabout way of, you know, the topic today is how to be your own healer. And so the first is, right, we're recognizing where when we're trying to be too perfect, because I think that's kind of like the root of a lot of problems that we have.
Being
right?
truthful,
and then right. And like the self-judgment, because so much of our pain and suffering really comes from the voice in our own head that we're buying into. Like you brought up earlier saying, you know, sometimes we're buying into belief systems that aren't even ours. Like maybe you had an abusive parent that told you were stupid and ugly and fat every day, and it turns out you're not. and you have to go through and unwire and reprogram the damage that was done there. And that's, and the way you do that is by giving yourself so much space and love, and just saying, you know what, I am not a perfect person, but I am not a monster. I have divinity within me. I am whole. I am complete. I'm healed. And recognizing in the moment when you are being critical, and stopping the thought and sending yourself, you know, doing that, going into that gratitude practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think I like what you were talking about in seeing your emotions, like you're welcoming happiness and you're acknowledging the sadness that's there. You're like, you address each of these emotions. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have in our society is people identifying with their emotions or their thoughts. Like, they feel like that is them. Because, I mean, just in the English language, you say, I am sad, I am happy. It's not like, no, I have this temporary emotion that's passing through, and it'll be different 5 minutes from now. So I think that's one of the biggest tools we can use to love ourselves and to heal kind of our mental and emotional bodies, is to stop identifying with your emotions. Like, see that is not who you are.
And recognizing that language really matters in that way, right? That like the way that, I mean, sometimes I'm like, oh, who cares? It's semantics, potato, whatever. But that sometimes language really does matter. And the way that the narration that we're hearing, to really start the healing process, you have to start to understand that narration in your mind isn't you, that it's just your ego. It's not who you are as a person. And I think, again, like I will probably every single episode will go back to like, and now you meditate, and that's how you find out. That's where you start to notice the distinction, is by sitting in silence. But I mean, even if you're not sitting in silence, you can start to recognize if meditation is overwhelming for you, or it seems too, like you don't know where to start with that, then just starting to recognize when you start to feel like, I'm so dumb, I'm so fat, or even when you say that in your mind, or even when you utter those words, that you can track it back and say, you know what, if I really feel like I'm not happy with my body, what is behind that? Because if you start to say, you know what, I love myself no matter what size I am. I love my breasts, I love my belly, I love my thighs, I love my arms, and I love myself, and I'm sending myself that, then we can start to shift. Okay, well, so then if you love yourself, what can you do to make healthier choices? Because a lot of times, you know, whenever we're doing things with our bodies that make us unhappy, I know for me, I can speak from personal experience. When my kids were little and they were like freaking out and crying, and like they would start, you know, when they're both little, 2 years apart, and one would start crying, the other one would start crying. And I would literally just walk straight to the pantry, and I would grab like 3 cookies, and I would just sit there, and I wouldn't even realize I was eating them until I got to like the 3rd one. And I was like, what am I doing? Like, oh my gosh, I need to deal with what that sound is doing to my, you know, my emotional system here. Like, why am I trying to stuff it down with this? So,
right. And I think too, like stopping and trying to understand, where is this coming from? You keep peeling back layers, and you go further and further back. And then you ultimately like get so far down that you're just sitting with the question of, who am I? You know, what am I? And like, for me, that's been a really helpful practice to like get to the point of that question, and then keep asking it, you know? I think.
Yeah. Do you want to go into the mind-body connection? I wanted to talk about just some of these tools that we can use for people. You know, what are some practices that people can do when they find themselves being faced with that perfectionistic voice in their minds, that, you know, that everything has to be a certain way. You were talking about, you know, asking that question of, who am I? And I think about identity, and I think about different times in my own life where I've really identified with my accomplishments, or with what I am doing in the moment, my job, or who I am. And I just think, you know, that is not a helpful way of living life, because what happens when you lose the job, or what happens when the landscape changes, you know? So how can we like de-identify? And the danger of that is that, you know, when things aren't like, when things are going great and we identify with our accomplishments, then hooray, ego, we're just feeling like on top of the world. But when when things aren't going the way that we'd like, we're still who we are. And so where are we left with that?
To me,
you know?
my perspective has kind of shifted lately with this, because I had been really highly focused on, okay, I have this underlying fear. I have this underlying perfectionism. Like, what am I going to do about it? How do I get rid of it? What kind of visualization can I do to like get rid of this? And last weekend, or maybe 2 weekends ago, I was thinking about it, and I just kept going down and down. And I realized, like, wait a minute, that is just my little tiny ego personality self. Like, it has a job. Its job is to be afraid. Its job is to like ensure my survival and organize information. Like, it's not real though. It's just this like framework for organizing information. Right. And so like, for me, like, I think trying to like dissect and figure out how to get that fear away from the ego is not the deepest solution. Like, the deepest solution was for me to realize like, oh wait, that's not even me. And then from that perspective, I can address my little ego self, be like, what do you need? Like, you're not in charge anymore, but how can I help you? Type thing.
Right.
So I think, I mean, there are, and it's different for everyone. Like, to get to that point, I mean, yeah, it's just finding whatever little piece of your brain can lead you to that realization, because it's not like new information. This is stuff that everyone knows, like, at the deepest level. It's just,
I think you brought up an interesting point though earlier that I think that comes in phases, and it's your tribal programming. Like you were talking about the beliefs, like that, to recognize what beliefs are yours and what beliefs have been put upon you. And it's not in terms of like religiosity, but really just your viewpoints about the world. Like, I remember the first time in my 20s kind of realizing that like, oh, I don't need to be so fearful of this. That's more of my parents' thing and not really mine anymore. And it was very liberating to think I don't have to obsess about that, whatever the issue was at the time. You know what I mean? And so I think asking yourself, is this even mine? Like that question first. If I'm being perfectionistic, why do I feel like I need to be perfect? Am I married to someone who's really critical? Is that a problem? Should I be thinking about what to do about that? Have I surrounded myself with people who belittle me? Have I never given myself permission to shine brightly in my life? Am I playing small? Asking ourselves those questions, bringing the awareness.
Definitely that's the place to start, is that awareness. And because then you just keep uncovering more and more things. As you learn more about yourself, it's this endless weird inner journey that is like sometimes really nice, sometimes really disturbing, sometimes baffling. Like it's work, it's not like, that's why it's so easy to walk around distracted and not even try to figure it out. Right.
And not want to deal with
it. Because it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of feelings, and it takes a lot of just work, to.
Sometimes it's easier just to like stuff it down and keep moving until our lives bring us to a place where we're forced to deal with it. Usually some sort of painful event comes to where, it's just too painful and we want to deal with what's behind it. So to talk about the tools that we can use or the attitudes we should adopt to help us release the suffering of our programming, we've been kind of discussing that, but I wanted to segue into when to work with healers and therapists. And within that, if you're starting a journey of self-discovery or you're in a transitional time, I find that the transitional times are usually when people this is when this stuff comes up. When you're just kind of going along and life is easy and you're status quo, you're not like asking life's deep questions. But when you lose a loved one or you get divorced or you lose your job or you're making it, or you're just feeling like it's time to have a big shift in our lives, this is when we start asking ourselves these questions. So even when you're working with healers or a therapist or, you know, massage, like a talk therapist or a massage therapist or something, you're still the only person who can really do your work, right?
Nothing can get done without the person's participation. Like, you can't have anyone else do it for you. And I've tried. I've definitely tried. Yeah, it doesn't work.
Right. Well, I wanted to talk about people coming in to sessions and not really being ready to let their stuff go, right? Like, there's sometimes that you'll have people that will come in to do a session and they'll be like, I just really want to, like, something's not working in my life. I don't know what it is. But like, when you get in there, they're really like not willing to give up the story, or they're not willing to they're not ready, because a lot of times the stories we tell ourselves about our victimhood or whatever happened to us when we were young, or about what's happening in our current circumstance, like, to let go of that story is like, we've identified, we've interwoven our identity so deep with that to de-identify with that would mean like you were saying, having to ask, like, you'd having to like basically reinvent yourself, or having to stand there and go, who am I really? And sometimes like you say, people aren't really willing to, some people aren't willing to do that. So those are the stories. The questions to ask are, what are the stories we tell ourselves that really prevent us from being our own healers?
And I think too, like, the reason why often we're so unwilling to let go of those is letting go means we have to then take responsibility for our lives. Like, what are you going to do once you realize you've been wrong in this certain belief and you're the only one responsible for your life? Like, that's a big task, you know, like, and it can be scary. It's intimidating, you know, especially if you're coming from a place of victimhood, where it's not your fault that these things happen to you, but it is your responsibility to do what you will with them, to live your life, and in whatever way you choose. Like, that's on you.
This is really, it makes me think of those stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and, you know, other traditions where they talk about these stories of like literal sacrifice, and how, you know, I always think all those stories are more mythological and more, we're supposed to look at them in terms of, you know, the allegory and the lesson. But, you know, what are we really willing to place on the altar of sacrifice? Are we willing to give up that story? Are we willing to literally like kill off that story so that a new experience can emerge, so that a new consciousness can be raised? Because if we are so identified with our pain and suffering, then we can't move on, right? You can't move to a higher new place. You're just stuck where you are.
I think like we get so attached to these ideas about ourselves because ultimately we are afraid of death. You know, like, especially in our culture, and we were just talking, we need to do another series on this, but I think it really, like, especially talking in terms of the ego and the individual personality, that operates from such a state of fearfulness. Like, it doesn't want to not exist, you know? And so, but like, to let that go, to surrender that idea, it panics, you know? it does everything to prevent that from happening, because that's just its nature. That's its job. But, yeah, that's like the big one, right? Like first the stories that you tell yourself, and then like ultimately the individual self, like.
Right. And again, we're talking about the mental, emotional body. So we're not talking about physical pain, or if you know, if you have cancer or something like that. But this is like, if these are the stories that we tell ourselves that causes emotional and mental pain and suffering. And that's really, I mean, if you think about, I don't know, I feel like in the world that we're living in now, right? They talk about it in the shamanic path as perceptual states, right? And right now, like most people are living in just the kind of like the reality of the physical world that like, yes, this terrible thing happened to me. And then those stories are then perpetuated through our emotions and our wiring about the ways that we view the world. But, you know, when you step back and you move to a higher place and you look at your life, then you just really start to see how, my gosh, we really are responsible for kind of creating everything that goes on, because we have control over our thoughts and we have control over the way that we react. And that's not to minimize extreme cases of violence or something, you know, or abuse or something that's happened. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it does make me think that we do have control over our inner world. And the way we can start to really refocus that is by contemplating ourselves in a loving way, by setting aside time for ourselves, and by really showing us, you know, what does self-love mean, right? There's so many cultures. I know the culture we were raised in was a lot of like what was glorified was like the most selfless people were like really held up as like, oh my gosh, look at how much service that person does. They're so amazing. Like they are so Christ-like, or they are so this way. And not to say that that's not a good thing, but when it's taken to the extreme where the message that's sent out is you are the last priority. Like you take care of everything else and everyone else, and you run yourself into the ground. And that is like the most noble thing you can do. Right.
Right. And then you create the martyr mentality.
Right. Right.
Which is just another form of victimhood. Yeah.
Right. Right. And that's across a lot of different cultures. You know, I mean, obviously we're drawing from our own life experience, but from a lot of different cultures that happens. And so understanding that like, we don't have to buy into that story, and that by taking time for yourself or asking for help when you need it, so that you can have some time for yourself, or like getting a babysitter when your kids are going crazy or whatever, that like that is that's self-care, and that is showing yourself compassion, you know?
Right. And I think too, along with that is really creating your own meaning for yourself, like discovering your own values, which are going to be different than your neighbors, you know, possibly. Because I think it was Viktor Frankl. Did you ever read his book, The Man's Search for Meaning?
I don't know if I have. I think I've got the book, and I can't remember. I mean, if I did, it was years ago.
Right. It's a really good book, but he talks about he was in a concentration camp during World War II.
Oh yes, I know. Yeah.
And he said in that book, he said that someone can. I'm probably going to say this really wrong, but he said someone can handle almost any how of living or doing something if they have a why, you know? And so going back to like confronting difficulties, whether they're like physical or emotional difficulties, you have to have a good reason. Like you can't trick yourself. Like no mental framework change that you want to make to help yourself be happier is going to stick unless you can understand and have a firm grasp on the meaning behind it, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I think too that, you know, when I think about like, what are people dealing with? And I think like I brought up transitions before, and as a female, right, we are constantly bombarded with messages of like you need to be beautiful, and you need to be a stay-at-home mom, and you need to be a full-time working mom at the same time. And you know, on a scale of 1 to Giselle, where do you land? Where are you in your perfectionism? You know what I'm saying? And you need to be like super thin right after you have a baby. And there's just these messages that are just downloaded to us, right? And so I think the perspective is, and when you're in your life, it's really hard because you're looking at your day to day. So I have compassion for that. And I'm trying to have compassion even for myself with whatever I'm dealing with at the moment. But I think to go back to this book that I read this week, I had read this Louise Hay book, and she had just recently passed away. And I actually opened the back of the book and read the back of the book, which I normally don't do. And she was reading, it was kind of her afterword. And she says, life goes in cycles. There's a time to do certain things, and then there is a time to move on. For many years, I had the pleasure of spending much of my time in my garden creating compost and feeding the earth. Really healthy soil grows flowers and fruits that are spectacular. I also grew most of the food that I ate. Then I tried living in a high-rise condo in downtown San Diego for a while. I thought having a terrace would be enough for my gardening, but it wasn't. Now I've come back to the soil and happily spend every free moment I have digging in the earth, planting and harvesting fruits and vegetables. There's nothing more delicious and healthy than fresh picked produce. She goes on to talk about, she lived until she was, I think, 91. And this is a woman, I just thought her life is a really neat example for women. She came out of like extreme abuse and really pulled herself out of that on her own. And like, she talks about this part of her life where she had it kind of quiet and it wasn't as busy. And she made all of her money, I would think, in her 60s. She wrote this book in the 80s. It was like 30 years ago. And then she started Hay House, which is a huge self-help publishing house that, published a lot of Wayne Dyer's work. And I just think for people who are bogged down with whatever they are at in their life, or if you are home with your kids and you're thinking, I love my children, but I don't feel like I matter or I value to society. Life is long. And this woman didn't even start her career until she was like 60. I mean, she was working along the way doing different things, but what she's known for and like the legacy that she's left behind didn't even start till she was in her 60s. And she goes on to talk about how she started ballroom dancing when she was 78, which I loved because obviously I was a ballroom dancer too, but I think, her life as an example, just that whatever we're in right now, whatever struggle we're in right now, it's just, this is today and tomorrow is different. And maybe the season that you're in is one where it's time to step back and nurture, and you don't have a lot of things to show for the work that you're doing. And maybe this is a time where it's just work, work, work. And it's like grinding it out and just trying to provide for your family, and just knowing that life is a long process, and to keep the perspective that there will be time for all of this, for whatever needs to happen. There will be time for that in your lifetime.
Yeah. So honor whatever season you're in. Seasons of the year too. Like it's really hot and humid here still. And I've never lived in like a humid climate before. I'm in Mexico.
Tropical.
Yeah. And so it's been hard to, like, some days it hits 2-3 in the afternoon and I'm just like sweating, and I'm dreaming of the Pacific Northwest, like freezing cold. But just, yeah, I think that's an important point you just made about honoring the season you're in and addressing things one at a time. Before we part, we'd like to say thanks for listening, and we hope you'll connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We would love to hear from you and appreciate all feedback, shares, and likes.
To learn more and subscribe to our newsletter, visit Intentionists.com. And no matter where you are or what you're creating, we send you love and invite you to breathe and begin.
See you next week.